So today I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about building software projects from my time over quite a number of years doing that. I'm currently working for Pleo, which is a very nice expensing software system. If anybody needs any expensing software, please talk to me afterwards. And before that, I worked at ThoughtWorks for quite a long time. So quite a lot of this material and experience, I do need to give some recognition to that experience. So let's get started. I guess what I'm trying to do here is summarize a lot of different things. So there's no kind of really depth of detail to it, but I'm trying to bring together all of the things that kind of like float around in my head about software delivery in general. And so I kind of like tried to bring that together in some form of structure. And this is what I've come up with as a kind of like model. And this is kind of like how I see the world of software when I'm thinking about it. On the right, left, your left, my left, are the three, what I take to be the three core parts of any kind of like software decision making or team. And I keep coming across this like time and time again whenever I sort of think about how the way teams work or how the way decisions are made. These three elements kind of like all come together, which is around like the delivery of the software, the tech part obviously, and also product. We can't forget product. And I've put customer in the middle just so we don't forget about them. They're always quite important. I should mention that I'm an engineer, so this is a little bit biased towards engineering. But I guess part of the point is to think about all of the disciplines that are involved together holistically and kind of like work out how we, in whatever discipline or silo we might be in, relate to those other ones. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do. There are kind of like four core categories that we're going to go through. We're going to talk about people a little bit. They're super important. We don't really get very far without people. We're going to talk a bit about some of the practices. I'm going to pull out a few that I particularly think are relevant. There's obviously many of them. We're going to hear a lot about them in some of the other talks today and tomorrow. So you'll get plenty of other opportunities for that kind of thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about products and platforms. Less so about these two, but they're kind of like related, and like platforms is a really big word. Like has anybody not heard the word platform used in context of any kind of like software organization or delivery? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about platforms, and maybe a little bit about the relationship between platforms and products. Okay. People. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Before we talk about people, what do I mean by like product and delivery and engineering? And this is just kind of like a high level how I kind of like see these things working together. So product is very much about like why are we building the thing? So I'm talking about software products here, right? Like, and maybe almost all products these days are kind of edging towards being software products, right? So certainly software products are quite important. So understanding the product, like why are we building it, who are we building it for, and what's the value proposition, and kind of like how we design it is obviously the kind of like one of the core ingredients that we need. Delivery sounds pretty familiar to everybody. Like, does everybody kind of like think about that? Like, we might talk about delivery managers or iteration managers or whatever. So delivery is about, I think, about the mechanics of how we make things roll along, like who's involved, how much does it cost, tracking all of that kind of stuff, navigating our way through. And then engineering, obviously, we need engineering. That's the core of actually making the thing. I tend to include all sort of disciplines in engineering. So like kind of like customer experience design and user design and front end and back end. It's all kind of infrastructure. It's all kind of like part of the same thing to me. So this triptych or three things of the three things that go together. I think there's an interesting thing about this, which is that no matter what scale of organization you are, even if you're sort of like one or two people making something or like a massive organization, then you kind of need these three elements whenever you're sort of deciding what to do or trying to like build a thing. And if you don't have them in balance, then you can get like shifted a little bit in the wrong direction with your product. And this is, I saw this the other day and I thought it was a really interesting article from Gregor Hopi. And he's done this thing where he's like, if you look at your organization and look at the relationship between the CIO, so that's basically like IT, and the rest of the board, like who they report to, you can kind of like reverse engineer the sort of emphasis that organization puts on IT. And so it's kind of interesting. If you're sort of reporting to the CFO, then it's likely that your organization is going to see IT as a kind of cost center. Whereas if it's the CEO, and that's quite an interesting one, right? Like the CEO directly has the CIO reporting to them. So they're having a much more kind of intimate connection with what's going on in the IT world and seeing it more as kind of an enabler. So this is a really great article he's got up on LinkedIn. But I guess what I'm trying to say there is that you can see how this sort of relationship between these three things goes from right at the small scale within a small team or with one person even just working on their own through to the shape of an entire organization. Okay, so we're going to go quickly now. Roughly, we've got a bit of time, so we'll try and go through the 4 kinds of categories. So people, I wanted to start with people because it's a kind of like classic thing, like pretty much everybody I would say these days recognizes that most of the hard problems are not so much about engineering. We kind of have solutions to a lot of engineering problems, right? But who here thinks that people is an easy problem to solve in their organization and getting people to work together and organize them, right? So I think there's been a talk this morning, like a workshop this morning about psychological safety, which is a really good thing. So I hope people got to see that. So I'm not going to talk in too much detail about that because I'm not an expert, but I do think it's important to think about a few things about people. I keep that in mind whenever we're like leading teams or trying to get teams to do things or building software. Oh, yeah, what's this? I forgot about this, of course. AI, right? Like, what about AI? I'm not going to say a lot about AI, but I'm going to, like, one thing I think that I've sort of noticed, the one observation I've had is that, AI is already in our teams, right? Like, we've got who's using ChatGPT or like, whatever it's called, the Git thing that helps you with programming. Yeah, Git Autopilot, right? So we're already starting to interact with these kind of things on a daily basis. And I guess my observation was that humans, we're quite good at anthropomorphizing things, right? We'll talk to like trees and stones and all kinds of things, right? So to me, anything that even starts vaguely resembling a human starts already feeling quite human. I find myself like saying thanks to like autopilot or whatever, and kind of like, hey, would you mind doing this for me? And kind of starting already to treat it like a kind of human. So I guess maybe my observation is that perhaps we'll start seeing like AIs as being kind of more and more part of our teams, and kind of like maybe they're not the most senior like engineers or whatever in our teams, but they might start more and more participating. So I'm going to leave it there. AI is a big topic, but I think it's coming. Okay, people. Who has ever been like scared at work? And I mean like scared like actually quite fearful because of some consequence of something or something that somebody said or whatever, or felt uncomfortable. Yes, me too. I've had, yeah, that's almost everybody, right? Like I love this quote. This is one I'm on a mission to try and get quotes from the film Dune into talks, and this is the first one. So, and I think this is what I always think of when I think about fear. So it really does like freeze us, right? A bit of fear is healthy. I'm a little bit nervous for doing the talk, so that's a good sort of like energy for talking. But in a work situation, it's a killer, right? It stifles our creativity, and we kind of like freeze. And it's certainly, if it starts getting to be at the team level, then it can be a really bad situation. And the kinds of things that can do that are sort of like overwork and too much pressure and all this kind of stuff, or generally like bad psychological safety in the team. So I think the reason I put this there is because I think a lot of the kind of practices that we think of as being like kind of modern practices, to me, they're about reducing levels of anxiety and fear and like kind of like automation and testing and all of that stuff. To me, it's about seeing if we can be as happy as we can be doing our job and making our products. And therefore, we're going to be the most creative and most productive. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I think like what I'm trying to do here is pull out a few kind of like key sort of references and whatever. So I don't know, like probably a lot of these will be familiar to people, but just in case they're here, and this is a good place to look. And I think when we're talking about our kind of like hierarchy of needs and this idea of, well, we need to feel like we're not about to die at any point. That's a starting point. And then we've got a kind of like general psychological safety. And then it gets a bit more involved. Like if we're working on our own, it can be sometimes quite rewarding, but actually when we're working as a team, that can really kind of like amplify those feelings. So I don't know if everybody, like, I find like if I'm in a team and we've had a big success at building something and it's delighted the customer and the other day our product owner was sort of dancing a jig or whatever. So it's kind of like that kind of like thing. It's quite a rewarding activity. So the more you work as a team to get that, the happier you are and the more productive you are. And then is everybody familiar with this thing? This is more of an individual thing on the left, like the autonomy, mastery, and purpose comes from this Daniel Pink's thing. That's referenced quite a lot. So that's about like, as an individual, what do we need? And I think this is important in terms of thinking about the individuals within the team and what they need to thrive and grow in their careers and be happy. If your team members are not happy, then you're not going to get good work, basically. So individuals, they have their own things, and then individuals work together in teams, and then we have sometimes more than one team, and as we get bigger and bigger and bigger, we have like lots of teams, and how do we kind of organize them around work? And I think one of the things here is about the scale of teams. Kind of like teams are like a unit, right? So you can have like a small team, you can have a big team, but there are sort of limits. Like you don't really want to have a team with 30 people in it. That's probably too big. And a team with like 2 people in it, is that really a team? Maybe it's sort of edging on the edge of not being a team and a bit hard to get those kinds of feelings that we saw before about being in a team and the satisfaction of belonging in a team. So I would tend to think that it's a good idea to have a kind of unit size which you're comfortable with, like maybe like a small team and a large team, and work out what that is for you, and then kind of fit it to the work. So a small team might have 1 or 2 things that they want to focus on. And here we're trying to talk about kind of like ownership of things, whatever it is, like scale of work. So sometimes you might find like you can make that work quite well. So one team owns either a bunch of small things, and that's kind of, so rather than having like each of those people own one of those things, like try and form them together in a team. Or you might find you've got like a massive thing, which is quite hard, probably should be broken down anyway. But the trick is not to make a team of like, whatever that is, like 20 people, just one big team, to like break down the team. And I've seen this like in practice in a lot of things. It seems to be like fairly common knowledge these days about how to build teams. And often we talk about kind of like bounded context, and this is a bit Conway's law type thing. But essentially it's kind of, this is the sort of principle of like, don't try and fragment people too much and try and like match them to the work. And don't break the rule of like breaking the team as a unit itself. And then what happens? Then, like, so this isn't relevant to like all organizations. So what we said before is kind of relevant to like pretty much any organization. Most people, unless you're like a one-person shop, you're going to have some kind of like teams, and you maybe like 1 or 2 teams of small teams. But there are places where you have kind of like 20, 30, 40 teams. I've been in those things. And then things get pretty complicated. But as it happens, there's kind of like a reasonably well-known now sort of solution space to this. So like, I don't know how many people have heard of team topologies. Exactly. It's already kind of like pretty well known, right? So I'm not going to like explain what team topologies is, but essentially it's about finding like the good boundaries between those teams and effective ways of like interactions with them, which is a little bit like platforms, which I'll talk about at the end. So it's kind of about encapsulating and understanding the relationships and making it flow easily. Okay. We're going to do a quick survey of some practices, which I think are particularly relevant. It's a little bit biased. There's the things that I really like, so there's not every practice in the world here, but some interesting ones. So we're going to start with product. I'm not a product person, and there's a lot of talks here actually about products, so that's great. There's going to be some awesome detailed product practices. But I've worked with quite a lot of product people in my role as a sort of like lead engineer. And the product to me, like in the three things, that's always the person who's really excited to say, but what about the customer, and where's the value in what we're doing here? Why do you want to go away and build that crazy tech thing that doesn't have any value? And something I keep coming back to is like, so this is a little bit about, okay, we've got this idea of what we want to build, or maybe we're looking at a quite complex organization with a lot of people and a lot of systems, and we're trying to work out what the hell is going on and how to organize the teams around it. And for me, it always comes back to, if you can think about who are the people, what is it that they're doing in the organization, and what do they need from the systems to help them do that thing. So that's kind of like the people and the activities they're doing. And these people don't necessarily have to be your customers. Some of them are your customers, but some of them are also your like operations people, or your support people, or your engineers even, right? So when we're thinking about how we design systems and group teams around those systems, that's kind of like the basis of what we're sort of looking at. This is a little bit like a kind of like service design blueprint kind of thing, but you don't necessarily need to be that formal about it. I've done this kind of exercise in a sort of less formal way, but just thinking about these kinds of levels. And this always sort of like helps me come unstuck from like the chaos of hearing loads of different perspectives and loads of different views. And somewhere in the middle, you know, there's this user journeys are a little bit more specific, right? So user journeys are quite specifically, if I'm interacting with a particular system and I'm going from screen to screen, what am I doing? So sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes you have to like jump across systems and so forth. So it's sort of a bit optional. What else am I going to say about product? Okay, so this is this other part of it. So I put this under product. It could go somewhere else, but I think it's kind of related to the way we design things. And what we're really talking about here is domain-driven design. Everybody knows domain-driven design now, right? Yeah, everybody uses domain-driven design in their thinking all the time. And I've just, again, let's not talk about domain-driven design. I'm just kind of like pointing it out. So to me, these two things at the bottom, the three things that are on there are the most important things. So first, it's about bounded context. This is about trying to like encapsulate things into smaller domains so that you can make sense of them, fit them in your head, as one of my colleagues would say. The two, well, maybe even the most important thing is this ubiquitous language. And so the ubiquitous language is about the way we talk about the systems and the domain, and trying to match that as closely to the domain of whatever the customer is working in. So that, remember, that customer could be like a tech person or your real customers or whatever. And getting, I mean, okay, so we all know like naming is the hardest problem in computer science, right? So it's always difficult, and it always causes confusion, right? Who has not been confused by some kind of naming somewhere in their organization when somebody referred to one thing as A and another, the same thing as B in a different part. So ubiquitous language, and this kind of concept of bounded context is fundamental to a lot of thinking. And some of the examples, for example, there's data mesh. Everybody heard of data mesh now? Yeah, it's starting to get more well. Yeah, these two, obviously. And so data mesh is kind of, in some ways, an application of domain-driven design to data, and thinking about this idea of data products, also relating a little bit to this idea of products, which we'll talk about again in a minute. And so we can kind of think of this bounded context as being an encapsulated capability, maybe, it's a loose word, for in our sort of systems thing. And there's basically things that owns a bunch of stuff, like maybe let's say orders or something in an e-commerce environment. And what we're looking for really is a kind of like clean way to interact with that thing. And so generally what you can do is you can perform actions on the thing. So you can ask it, create me an order. And these days, generally what we think about of the ways of communicating to other systems is either we're like firing out events, so we're doing some kind of event-driven thing, or maybe we're accessing the data that comes out of it, and in the data mesh terms, we'd be thinking of those as data products. And I've put this thing at the bottom. I think this is a really interesting recent work by Malcolm Sparks at Juxt. You can look it up. And he's kind of trying to bring all of these ideas together and put them into a kind of platform, actually, interestingly, with a kind of set of well-defined principles and kind of like rules, which are then encoded into the platform. And it's all about this idea of trying to keep this as formulated and structured as possible across a larger estate. Again, this is maybe not quite as relevant if you're just a team of like 5 people with like one kind of like monolithic application. But when you get into the scale of having multiple systems interacting together, it becomes more important. So I think these, like I said, I kind of put them under product because it's about this borderline between how do we shape the product. And if we get these things kind of like wrong, quite often it makes it difficult for us to do the product things that we want to achieve because things are too coupled or entangled. Delivery. I'm only going to say that one small thing about delivery, really, which is that I tend to think of it as navigating, like trying to find your way from A to B, wherever the product people want you to go, wherever the product wants to be, wherever it wants to go. And then sometimes, there's obstacles in the way. Do we want to go over the mountain, around the mountain? And deciding how to go and where to go, that's when the cycle comes back in, right? Like if we have any one of those three things sort of overwhelming the decision-making process, we tend to take strange routes. Maybe we're a little bit too excited about product features and we're not really taking account of some of the more engineering things like, is it secure? Will it fall over? Should it really be synchronous or asynchronous? Which can actually, like, in the end, destroy even your customer experience because you didn't really take them into account and you were just listening to the product. The same route, you might build something that costs you way more than it's ever going to be worth, and I'd sort of expect the delivery mindset to kind of like catch that out and work it out. Yeah, dependencies, again, is a little bit like what we talked about before. It's quite difficult to manage multiple teams all over the thing, and so having this kind of like clear idea of where you're going helps with that. And then the other big thing that helps is, this is a very kind of like classic Agile thing. Lots of people say it all the time, and I hope everybody takes it to heart. But trying to break things into as smaller steps as you can. So small iterations, MVPs, whatever, however you want to call it, but just trying to work out either very obvious stepping stones towards a live in the hands of customers experience, or an actual release into the hands of customers is the idea. Engineering. Like, I could talk for several days about engineering practices, which I'm not going to do. What I was really wanting to say here is that for me, like, I'm quite old, I've been around for a while, and I remember when I first sort of really got into coding and Agile and whatever, it was all about XP. And actually, out of all of the things that I've ever learned, like XP, I just keep coming back to. Like the practices that are in there are still as relevant today as they ever have been, as far as I'm concerned. And what I really love about it is, so firstly, it's focused on the making of the code, right? Like that's where they came from. They were sitting down, they were making code together, and they were thinking, okay, this is sort of working. What happens if we do this all the time? Does that make us work even better? And they kind of found that it did. So you don't necessarily have to like adopt the full extreme attitude, but thinking about these practices and trying to think like, have I tried this? Is it working for me? Can it work? Could I be better? I think is a great way to start. Some of these other things. Oh look, infrastructure as code. Actually, hello Keith. Keith's actually going to do a little talk after this sometime at 2 o'clock this afternoon. So that's quite nice to have him in the audience. Is everybody familiar with all of these things? Maybe not the sensible defaults. I'll talk a bit about that. Integration patterns. So kind of integration patterns and Kubernetes. I just picked a random Kubernetes book. I've not necessarily read that one. But pretty much these days, big scale systems seem to be converging around like, I didn't put microservices up there, like event-driven kind of systems using Kubernetes as a sort of deployment thing. So there are some sort of trends evolving that are kind of, that's what people do pretty much when they do big systems these days. Sensible defaults is an interesting thing. I think you can go and look at that up on the ThoughtWorks website. I did look it up earlier. ThoughtWorks in the house there on the left. And this is something that we had in ThoughtWorks for like many, many years. And the idea is like a bunch of practices in all kinds of different areas, a bit like this talk in some ways across different delivery, engineering, and product, that are not necessarily like mandatory, like you must do it like this, but like you're not likely to go too wrong if you use these things. So that's well worth a look in terms of some more detailed advice. Yeah, maybe being an engineer, I should talk a little bit about architecture and so forth. And Gregor, his books, read anything by Gregor. I've got a list of people in a minute as well. But yeah, basically that's one of the best books I've read about architecture. And interestingly, he's also talking about his metaphor in there is kind of about scale. So if like engineering's on the ground floor of the building and the boardroom is at the top floor, and you have to navigate and go down through all the different floors. And if you don't spend time at the different floors, then you lose too much context of what's going on, and you're not able to make these kind of decisions at the big level because you're kind of getting out of that loop of both the scale and the three sort of disciplines. Yeah, good. So I'm going to pick on two. I'm going to go back to the classics here. Like I'm not sure we've had a talk on TDD here for quite a few years. We did have some like a few years ago, but I thought it's worth a reminder. So I'm quite interested here. Like how I don't know. First of all, how many people are actual engineers in the audience, as opposed to that's good. Yeah, okay. How many people use TDD? Yeah, some sort of yeah. How many people use TDD on a daily basis in their work? Few, good. Just give some fans, awesome. Yeah, cool. We'll do some more surveys in a minute. So, like, everybody understands this thing, right? So it's very simple TDD. Just write the test first. That's basically the mantra. And I suppose the reason I mention it is because I've done quite a lot of TDD. I'm a big fan of it, and it is a really good way to kind of like structure, a bit like this navigation again, but in the smaller scale when we're navigating from one piece of code to the next and trying to make sense. And it really kind of like helps us move together down those things. And this, I noticed I put tidy. That used to be sort of more like kind of like refactor, red-green refactor. And Kent Beck, who I forgot to mention, Kent Beck is probably one of my biggest heroes in software. I think read everything and anything by Kent Beck. You can't really go wrong. He was kind of like at the heart of XP and pair programming and TDD, and he wrote the test-driven development book. And he's recently done this tidy first book. So he's always like refining his ideas, and he's kind of more in this idea now of like, what if we? And he's always kind of like talked about this a little bit before, but before we even start trying to write our tests, what if we try to make our code easier to change before we then make the change? And this is like a common thing he's always thought. And you can apply this at different scales. So if we want to add a new feature or a whole new product line, and we think about that's going to be really difficult because all of these problems in our way, how can we change our organization or change our code or change our systems to make that change easier and kind of work back from there and try and go back in steps? And so I highly recommend a bit of Kent. So the other one I want to talk about, pair programming. Okay, so now how many people who are engineers do pair programming on a regular basis? Oh, that's great. Awesome, yeah. I don't know if everybody's ever read this book. This is a great book on pair programming. It's quite funny. It's also a bit about people as well. So how different people interact when they're trying to work together. What happens if you get an extrovert and an introvert, or two introverts? And it's a great book. So I've put pair programming a kind of bit into context here because I think there's a little bit of a sort of spectrum, right? Like, so who uses like pull requests seems to be a fairly common pattern. Anybody using like trunk-based development as a regular thing? So pair programming. I think you were like, were you doing TDD as well? Awesome, yeah, you're in my gang. So yeah, so like, I kind of jokingly thinking like, well, pull request is a bit like pair programming, but just like the hard way, right? So I write something and then I send it to somebody, and then you get a bit of feedback and you go back and forth, and maybe they're there, maybe they're not. And it can work if you're sort of disciplined about it. But it's a little bit like doing pair programming, but like the hard way. And also even like just interacting on Slack. The other day I was trying to do something on my own, and I was basically like constantly chattering on Slack to somebody who knew more about the code than me, and I was like, well, you know, maybe we could just be sitting together and having this conversation, right? So I think there are certain times when it's just natural that people feel like they want to pair. And so I don't necessarily say that people like have to pair, but I do think it's worthwhile thinking about, can you amplify it maybe more or do it more often? Because I think pretty much, I mean, I'd be surprised if does anybody really like work completely on their own when they're coding? Like has no communication with any other developers? Pretty unlikely, right? So we're kind of already doing pair programming, we're just doing it a bit further away than we do. And then you can go to the extreme of mob programming. And I was talking with Al earlier. Everybody wants to know about mob programming. he's been experimenting with it in his organization. They've been having some fun doing that. So we could go to the extreme of mod programming. We've had talks on mod programming before. Again, not really going to go into that. It's kind of just an extension of that idea, really. And then bringing it together, TDD and pair programming is just like the best combination. If you do them both at the same time, because pairing is kind of like sometimes quite difficult to know who's doing what and where you're doing, and the tests and writing the whole point of doing TDE as a kind of design activity, it sort of slows you down, makes you do like step by step, allows plenty of space for you to like have conversations about what's going on, and it's a really nice structured way. You can even do like there's the classic idea of like ping pong, where one person writes the test and then the other person implements it. So they kind of really, I think they're really synergistic and at the heart. I mean, really, in the end, no matter what else you have all around, all the delivery practices, all the product practices, all of that stuff is at a bigger scale. In the end, what we're doing is making code as developers and engineers in a small team, hopefully with our product people closely connected to us. And just to wrap this section up, these are a few people. A lot of them wrote, oh, there's Keith. Hello, Keith. A lot of them wrote some of the books that you saw before. Nicole and Jez did like Accelerate, and everybody's read Accelerate, right? That's like a really awesome book about how you go and about managing developer efficiency, dangerous word, at scale. Gregor we've talked about, Kent we've talked about, and John. Actually, I didn't really mention much about John Cutler, but he's a great person on the product side. I don't know if anybody's watching him. I was like seeing really interesting insights from him. I don't really know how he manages to come up with all these insights. It's quite impressive. Okay, so we're kind of heading towards the end now, which is good. So we've just got 2 more sections. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into these. They're not totally my kind of speciality, but I think they do kind of like work a little bit together. So products. This is my simplified product view. This is how I think of like product. Basically, this is where it's really important, the customer, right? Like that's the main thing. We're making a product for a customer. If we're making a product and we haven't got a customer, like what we do, what is that? Is that even a thing, right? Like, and if we've got a customer and we haven't got a product, then we're like either missing an opportunity or that customer's like, yeah, it's like a niche, right? It's a niche that could be exploited. So that's sort of at the core of everything. And then I think, like as like lots of other talks about product, but the essential element of it is to sort of try and iterate and experiment and work out what the right things for that customer are, listen to the customers, not always listen to them, but provide them new things. And that's kind of a core part of the practice of product. And then there's this kind of like sort of value exchange kind of like transactional thing going on. So right, we're creating a product which has value to the customer, and the customer gives us something back in return, right? Like, so they might like, well, hopefully they like pay us or buy a subscription or whatever, and they're happy, and the reason they're paying is because we're taking something that was maybe like hassly for them to do and doing it for them, or making something easier, giving them something back, or giving them some value, right? And when we're thinking about a lot of product, and whenever we're talking about a high level kind of like roadmaps with product people and whatever, we're often talking about things like what are our goals and what are our objectives and what are our kind of like initiatives that we're going to do, maybe our OKRs if we're into that. And a lot of that comes down to, well, how do we know whether we have done this? How do we know whether we've made somebody happy, or how do we know whether this product's really working? Did we make any money? It's all about measuring. And this, like, Accelerate also has quite a lot of stuff about measuring, and I believe it's kind of inspired. That's how I found this book as well, How to Measure Anything. This is a really great book about things that you might think are hard to measure, like quality or productivity, and ways that you can, like, sort of strategies for doing it. And it's kind of like, principle is that there's nothing that you can't measure if you think about it right. And then the final thing about products that I'm going to talk about here anyway as well is that, like, who's the customer? So traditionally, the customer is the person outside the organization who pays you money for your product and you make the product for them. But as we move into thinking about kind of like platforms and internal products, and maybe even those like domain-bounded contexts that we talked about, The customer can be anyone, really. And so it could be another team, it could be your customer service people, it could be developers in another team, it could be your product owners. It could be other organizations who are integrating with you and need to talk to your APIs, so third-party developers. So this concept of a product and a customer is quite generalizable and can extend to almost anything. And that's kind of why I talked about software products as a thing. So we're building some software thing, and it's got a customer, and it has some value. And the payback may not be like direct revenue. Like if we're inside an organization, it might be kind of like budget allocation, or just generally like measured on how useful people feel that whatever your product is that you're developing. And it's kind of, I think this is a growing mindset shift that a lot of organizations are thinking about now. And I sort of think about it, people talk about like the product mindset, platform as a product, products as platform, it's products sometimes can be platforms to other people. So these things start getting really kind of like mixed up. So I think that's quite an important point. And then finally, we get to platforms. Platforms. Like what is it? What is a platform anyway? Like that word gets used a lot, right? And I've got a kind of like basic definition that I sort of keep in my head of it. And really some elements about platforms are that they kind of should encapsulate something that is quite tricky usually sometimes, and maybe like you don't really want to know what's going on in there. You just want the outcome of it, whatever it is. AWS, great example. I don't really want to know how the hard disks and all of that work. I just want maybe even a Lambda I just want something to execute for me on somewhere. And again, there's this kind of like, so this is where it kind of like gets similar, right? It's all a bit like a product, because basically what you're doing is trying to provide some value to some customers through the thing that you're doing. And this is a classic thing. And has anybody ever been involved in a platform project in their organization which didn't really, it was more like build it, they will come kind of platform. And they sort of built a very nice platform with loads of great features, but not that many people really used it. And so now we're really talking about thinking about our platforms as if they were products and applying all the same kind of like techniques to them, measuring their impact, just interviewing customers. And in Pleo, where I work now, there's a great example of this. Like the platform team actually are doing a survey, and they came and talked to me and asked me a bunch of questions, like awesome, like customer research about the platform. What's good for it? What's it doing for you? What's it not doing for you? Where can we improve? And then really like, because like I say, a platform is not much use unless people are using it. It's not really providing value. So this idea of trying to get people to adopt the platform, and that's very much like you're trying to get people to adopt your product if you're trying to release a product into any kind of ecosystem. So thinking about the internal ecosystem of your company as the marketplace, and you're trying to promote your product, which you've got a great idea for, because you think it's going to solve some problem for somebody and give them some value. And the final thing I wanted to say about platforms at this point is there's some economics going on here, right? So if you're a smaller organization, chances are you're not probably going to have like a 10-person platform engineering team, right? Building all these like exciting things. So you're probably more likely to be shifting towards platforms that exist outside your organization already made, kind of like, so like some like managed service offerings from AWS, for example, or like much like higher level abstractions there, which you want to see. So there's this kind of like idea of like, how much is it really worth it? And even in large organizations, people can get a little bit carried away with, we really need to have like we must have like a platform engineering team, and just like be kind of aware of what the true economics are. Which again is kind of like product mindset, right? Like what's the real value we're delivering versus the cost of building this thing. Oh, I missed one really important thing about platforms. Well, the most key thing is that what you don't want to happen is that every time somebody outside your platform wants something from the platform, they have to like raise a ticket with the people inside the platform to get that to happen. That's not really a platform. That's just a bottleneck team that's going on. So what you need is, you need this boundary to be quite solid and have the interface very clearly defined. And the ultimate interface is like completely self-service. Like I don't have to raise a ticket to somebody in AWS when I want to provision an EC2 instance, right? Like it's all automated. Everything's infrastructure as code. and it kind of like all works beautifully. So this concept of thinking about the thing I'm making and trying to make it as encapsulated as possible and have this very clear interface and as self-service and is one of the most critical points about it is it allows you to scale. Like you can have a small number of people operating the platform and a large number of consumers. And then again, that's back to kind of like economics, because if you spent a lot of money on building something and you've only got one person using it, it's probably not a good trade-off. Okay. I think we're there. So we kind of like covered a lot of different things. I tried to bring them all together. And I guess really like the main idea was just to sort of put all those things in your head at the same time and see what happens. And kind of that's what's sloshing about in my head quite a lot of the time when I think about these things. And I would say like as people get, as you kind of like get more maybe like senior in whatever role you're in, understanding these different areas starts becoming kind of like more significant. I think I'll stop there. That's it. Thanks. Have we got, a few minutes for questions, and that's right, isn't it? Yeah. Ideal.
We can definitely take a few questions. Anyone got any questions?
So all your insights to great talk. I've got a question about not programming. You're experimenting with this. You're on a Friday. You're doing something a bit different. Students focus on solving the problem, scratching an itch. That's been saying. But what tips do you have for organising that session so it can be something to chaos or outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where it comes back. Like the TDD and kind of idea starts working then. So, and also this concept of like navigation. Like, if you're not kind of like as a group understanding what where are we trying to get to here, then it's going to get very confusing, right? So one kind of like practical tip is, I think maybe you were doing that, but like is taking turns being the person who's actually sort of operating the code and sort of rotating that around. And that kind of like forces everybody to take the steering wheel, as it were. But then there's also the kind of like, and this is very similar to pair programming as well, right? Like, so what I always like to do with in a pairing session is before you actually start typing on the keyboard, work out a kind of like rough plan. Sometimes you might do it on sticky notes or in Miro or whatever. But like, what are the steps? Like Kent Becking, like what are the steps we're planning to do? And then we kind of all know where we are in the journey as we're going. So I think that's probably like at the core of what you're asking now. Like, yeah, how do you keep everybody? And interestingly, that's a little bit like, how do you keep everybody, if there are like 2 or 3 or 4 teams all trying to work on the same, like going on the same journey, and they all have dependencies and need anything. If everybody doesn't have a very clear idea about what the steps in those journeys are, and as a sort of senior engineer, I tend to spend quite a lot of my time doing that, in fact, like understanding what the actual journey is and explaining it to everybody and making sure everybody's kind of like on the same path. Maybe having a person, maybe that could be a person who's like the navigator, but for the group, like so who has that idea of where they're going to sort of help make it go there. Nice. Thanks, Al. Yeah, anyone? Yes? Hi.
Okay, so I work in software development, and my company, we do follow the MVP mindset of ideate, create a how very fast in order to release faster and then learn from that. But then after that, you will definitely have some releases, learnings, and you will adapt the code. But then the main challenge that I sometimes face is that you want to create a code that is simple and fast, as I said, but also scalable enough and easier to change once you learn. But then sometimes you don't know how to, and you also don't want to kind of recreate a code from scratch. So what tips do you have in order to navigate those concepts?
That's good. Yeah, that's a kind of like classic trade-off, isn't it? Like, you don't want to like sort of over-engineer. I always come back like, so this is one of the first things I kind of remember really conceptualizing when I started, when we were doing XP, like back in the day. It's kind of like like the rule of 3, like you sort of, you do something the first time and you sort of get it roughly right. And then you do it the second time, you start seeing the like patterns between it. And then by the third time, you're kind of really able to see where the abstractions actually are. And that's when you want to like start trying to like really pull out those abstractions. So I think there's a part of it is about a constant process of looking for those things, and it's a delicate balance between going too far too quickly, because if you make the wrong abstraction, that can also get you in trouble. I remember Eric Evans once on a podcast saying about domain-driven design that you're very unlikely to get your domain design right like the first time. And so this is a bit abstract, but like basically the idea he was putting forward is to optimize for being able to like do more designs rather than take the first design you do and then try and really like solidify and crystallize around it. So I'm not quite sure how that exactly plays out in your scenario, but some of the tools that help you are actually kind of like the TDD, but TDD done in a thoughtful way. It's like you can also like make tests which clarify, kind of like constrict you, right? Like you can get the situation where you have like too many tests, and when you try and change something, everything breaks. So it's kind of, and actually like Kent Beck is a really good person to read about some of it in his tidy. That's kind of what tidy first is about what he's been trying to do is understand what are the essences of design, software design, that kind of like lead to those properties to make it easier to change as you go. So yeah, it's like rule of three, sort of looking out for those like right abstractions. The ancient classics of coupling and cohesion, right? Like that's a big thing. And sort of, literally recently had an experience where we were trying to just like upgrade some stuff in a large kind of like monolith, and it's really hard because everything depends on loads of different things. And so having things broken into smaller parts can help. That's a great. I mean, that's a tough challenge, the eternal challenge. Yeah, happy to talk some more after.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim.
All right, thanks.